Morning. Good to stand before you. Looking forward to presenting some thoughts for us all to consider. Appreciate every person being here this morning. Certainly, I believe we know there's nothing more important we can be doing than trying to understand the will of our Father. I think sometimes people have, the ideal of going to church is almost like a ritual, a ceremony that needs to be gone through. And that's just not the way to think about it. We need to try to think about it in terms of coming to honor our Father, coming as He's instructed us to have fellowship with Him and with one another. And certainly part of that is worshiping Him. And sometimes I'll hear people say this, and I've tried to say it with my family, is instead of saying, let's go to church, I'll say, let's go worship. We're going to worship. And it helps convey what we need to be having in our mind. I'm not saying it's wrong every time you say, let's go to church, but understand what we're doing. We're coming to worship our Father. And there's a tendency, because of the way our auditoriums are set up, there's a tendency to feel like you guys are the audience and whoever's up here is the performer, song leader, a teacher, preacher. And that's certainly incorrect. That is incorrect. We are all active participants in the worship service that is going on. The audience is our Father in heaven. We're doing this for Him. And it is for our benefit. It resounds to our benefit to follow His instructions. And His instructions are for our good always. The emblems of the Lord's Supper are a perfect example. He doesn't need us to engage in that activity. We need to engage in that activity. We need to be reminded of what He did for us. And all of what He's commanded us in worship, the prayers, the singing, the instruction, remember, He didn't need people to sing to Him. He didn't need people to read His words. He wants to have a relationship with you. He wants to have a relationship with you. And that means us coming to understand Him and giving Him the glory that He deserves. And so the word that I want to consider this morning along those lines is just simply the word worship. The word worship. I just want to consider that with you. As I started scratching this surface, I realized there is no way to do an exhaustive study on worship in one sermon. So what I'm going to basically try to do, as I often do, is just try to start scratching the surface with you and hopefully whet your appetite to dig into it and think about it and meditate on it. So the question basically is what does it mean to worship God? What does it mean to worship God? If you look it up in the English, in our English language, Oxford describes it as a feeling or expression of reverence or adoration. That's the noun. You feel, you express reverence, love, adoration towards something, usually a deity. That's the idea. The verb version of that is just to show that feeling of adoration, to show that feeling of respect and admiration or fear. So that's what we're describing. I was interested to discover, because I hadn't known this, I hadn't realized it, I should say, but there's 6 words in the Greek language that are translated worship in our English Bibles. So, similar to love, when you start studying love, we have one English word for love, and you have 4 Greek words that describe very different forms of love. In English, we're using the word worship, and we do have some other, words that we would use as well along those lines. But in the Greek, what our Bibles translate as worship, there's 6 different words. So I tried to do kind of a word study, and I started saying, okay, well, let's define these words, let's see where they're used, and let's try to see some kind of difference here. And that was really hard. I'll tell you, I did not see this in terms of, like we do with agape love, that's one kind of love. And phileo love, that's another kind of love, and you need to understand the different usage. What I discovered, at least in my opinion at this point, my understanding is These words that are translated worship in our English Bible, 6 different Greek words, are all very, very similar. They're very similar, very difficult to differentiate between. And so I'm going to make very little effort this morning to differentiate between them. I think they're very much overlapping. I'm going to try to define them a little bit, but I believe that they're all kind of tied together in the same concept of what we're trying to do when we worship God. We're trying to honor him. We're trying to hold him up. We're trying to acknowledge who he is and how great he is. And there's a lot of aspects to that. And that's what I would say is with the Greek word, the 6 different Greek words, what's being expressed more than a distinction is just different aspects of the same thing. We're trying to honor this being that we can't even really fully comprehend. We're trying to hold him up in his proper position when we can't even begin to grasp how great he is. And that's part of, I think, why we have these different words. But one of the words, and as I was studying the New Testament breakdown of this word is used more than 60 times in the New Testament. By far, when you read the word worship in your New Testament, more than likely it's this word. It's used the most. And it means what we oftentimes, I've heard defined growing up, is to kiss towards. To kiss towards. And, I remember growing up thinking, well, what in the world does that mean? Now somebody needs to define that. What does that mean, to kiss towards? I was reading different definitions, and one of them described it like a dog licking his master's hand. And I was like, wow, that's worth thinking on. That's worth meditating on, because you think about the way that a dog feels toward his master: adoration, ultimate respect, ultimate reverence, trying desperately. You ever had a dog just desperate for your attention, desperate for your approval? That's the ideal. And he's going toward, have you ever been walking around trying to do something and the dog comes and he's licking your hand, trying to get your attention, trying to let you know he's excited to be with you. He is excited you walked out of the house. He wants to do something with you. This is the ideal of trying to show our position next to God, trying to show our love for him. Again, our adoration. I keep coming back to that word adoration in my mind. It carries with it also the idea of to prostrate or to do homage, like falling on your knees, falling at the feet of someone. When a person, we don't really do that in our culture. I don't think anyone here has ever fallen at my feet. But you could imagine the emotion that would be involved in that. If you were to fall at someone's feet, what is that? Why are you doing that? Well, it would be you acknowledging their position. It would be you acknowledging, even if it was just for a certain interaction, have mercy on me. You have this position. You have the ability in this situation to determine my fate. So you bow before them to show the reverence, to show the deference that you are feeling toward them. And that's part of what's going on. This does not necessarily, there's a group of words, there were 3 of these Greek words that did not necessarily imply any action. It was very interesting trying to understand that. I still don't feel like I completely have my mind around it, but it really is more expression or expressive of the feeling. And as I go through some of the verses, we'll go through several verses. I think one of the things I wanted to convey to you is that worship is not always tied to an action. It's more than, I see Martin's mouthing the word attitude. And I really believe that that's true. I think I have always seen worship more in terms of an action. I'm going to worship. And so then, well, what is that? What is it to worship? And there are some actions clearly that are involved in worship. But there are several of these verses where no action is implied. No action is implied. They're worshiping with their attitude. They're worshiping with their emotion. And that really 3 of these words, there's no implication of action whatsoever. So I'll just put some more thought on top of that. The definitions here: to revere, a feeling of awe or devotion, to be afraid, to honor religiously. To honor religiously. Does that include action? Certainly, but just a feeling of admiration, a feeling of devotion, of to honor someone, to honor God, as we're talking about. It can be done internally, and certainly it will be done also externally if that is true internally. One of the words defined to act piously toward, to act piously or wholly toward, respecting, showing respect for, what that entity would want, showing respect for what that person would want. A couple of the words centered very much around service, and sometimes are even translated service, to worship or to serve. One of the words implied a service for hire, as if it was an employee almost, and one of the words did not imply that. Just a flat service. Just I am serving this one. So worship, as it's again translated often in our Bibles, can also just mean to serve. To serve. I'm doing the will of this person. I'm doing the will of the one to whom I am worshiping. So again, my opinion at this point is to separate between them, to try to make clear distinctions and say, well, this verse uses this word, and so we need to understand that. I don't feel that gets you anywhere or gets you very far. I feel like they're very much tied together. One thought, let me tell you, and I might should have started with this, but go to Hebrews 11 real quick. These thoughts all stemmed. I got started on this from Hebrews 11. I've been studying that in the high school class. And in Hebrews 11, there's the example of Jacob. Jacob in verse 21, of course, Jacob famous for several things, mostly probably the 12 sons, right? 12 sons of Jacob. He also, very interesting story where he wrestles with God. That's a story that I've been trying to meditate on and try to get some more out of. This verse doesn't mention those other than it mentions his sons. It says he blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And I was just kind of breaking that idea down in my mind, bowing in worship over the head of the staff. You go back to that story, I believe it's Genesis 49, and there's no indication of worship. It doesn't use that concept or that word. So you would read Genesis 49, and all you would see from that, from reading the narrative, is Jacob blessed Ephraim and Manasseh. That's what happened. Jacob blessed them. This verse adds that was worship, that he was worshiping when he did that. And again, it gets down to the attitude, as I was trying to understand that. And really, that concept and understanding that, I think, captures what I want to convey this morning. Anytime you do something to honor the will of God, and again, that doesn't mean you get to define it. I think this is sometimes where people get off and they say, well, I'm going to honor God by doing what I want to do. That doesn't work. What Jacob was doing here was he was doing the will of God. God had given him some information by way of blessings for these two individuals, Ephraim and Manasseh, and by bowing over the head of his staff and saying what God had told him, by just simply repeating what God had told him, he was worshiping. That was a worship. And again, as I meditate on that, and as I think on that, it connects to every aspect of our life. And this is where I don't want, again, when we say, hey, I'm going to worship, we're talking about going to the worship assembly. We're going to worship with other Christians. But as you zoom out from that just a little bit, I think you get to this concept that anytime we're giving honor to God in our life, anytime we are doing the will of our Father, anytime we're doing God's will, not our own, but anytime we're doing God's will, we are worshiping Him. And you could describe that very act as being an act of worship, in that you are submitting to Him, in that you are governing your life with an attitude of worship, with a mentality of worship. What I wanted to do with the kind of the middle part of this lesson is go to the book of Matthew. If you would turn to Matthew, the reason for that is as I was studying and doing my word searches, I found all of the words for worship, all 6 of the words used in Matthew. I also felt Matthew used the word more than any other book in the New Testament. So you see several different examples of the usage of it, how it's used. And with each of these stories, I feel like you can just get a little bit of depth, a little bit of context for how to think about this word. And again, what I want us to be doing as we go through these examples in Matthew is just be thinking about, what does it look like to worship God? What does it look like when I worship God? And again, getting away from the concept of it being just when we come together. Like, what does it look like when I worship God in my everyday life on a moment-to-moment basis, which I believe that is how to understand this. I'm sorry for the sniffles, but I cannot get rid of them. Matthew chapter 2 is the first usage here. Matthew chapter 2, we have the example of the wise men's visit. They say, and when they come to Herod, remember they had seen the star, they came from the east. The misunderstanding sometimes is that, they came right there to the manger and saw the baby. I think that really, as you think about it, coming from the east indicates a passage of time, and then this would have been, quite a ways later after the immediate birth. But regardless, they tell Herod in verse 8, I'm sorry, is that the first one? Verse 2, I'm sorry, verse 2. They said, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." They had come to worship. They had come for the purpose of worshiping him. I think that is similar usage, similar thought process to how we would use it in coming to worship, coming for the purpose of worship. Their very journey, their very travel, their mindset of wanting to do this could be described as worship. But they had come to worship. They had come for the purpose of worshiping. Herod, in talking to them, he tells them in verse 8, he says, "Go search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." So here Herod is using the same word, to describe the same purpose they were describing. But we know from the story that Herod had no intention of worshiping him. That was a lie. And so you can see him, misusing that concept. And for him, it would not have meant anything. In verse 11, they go to the house. They see the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasure, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I know in my mind, I think I have connected the ideal of them worshiping with the ideal of them giving gifts. It's interesting to me the way this is said. They fell down and worshiped him, then opened their treasures and gave him gifts. So the worship was done before the gifts were given. And I'll go ahead and say this: the giving of the gifts was a form of worship. Everything in their mentality was worship, but they worshiped before they gave the gifts. And what I wanted to ask you is, what did that look like? What did that sound like? How long did that take? They fell down and they worshiped. Just imagine that scene. What does that look like in your mind? Does that take 5 minutes? Does that take an hour? Is anything being said, or are they just falling down, worshiping? To me, there's some beauty in the fact that we don't know the answer to those questions. That can look differently, I think, for different people. They were there to worship, and they fell down and they worshiped. They were honoring him. They were giving him deference. They were adoring him. That could take a lot of different forms. That could look very differently. It comes back to attitude. I would say I don't think a word needed to be said for them to worship. I don't think any particular action had to be done. Did they need to actually touch his feet? Did they have to hold his hand? Did they have to, be on their knees? Did they have to lift their hands to heaven? Did they have to do anything in particular to be worshiping? No, they were there for the purpose of worshiping, and when they saw him, they fell down and they worshiped. And I'll make a distinction here because some of the verses that we're going to get to blur that idea, but this is a good verse to see a distinction between the falling down and the worship. Because again, sometimes I think we put that together and say, well, worship means falling down. So this was the same thing. And if you look it up, there's two separate words here. They fell down and then they worship. In some of the verses, we're going to see that's not the case. But worship does not necessarily include falling down. That was just something else here. They fell down. That was part of what they did, but the worshiping was separate from that. And again, I'm just trying to plant thoughts. I want you to think about what that would have looked like. I want you to think about what worship looked like here. And then by extension, I want you to take that into your life and think about what does worship look like in my life? How am I worshiping God? Is really what I want you to think with each one of these stories. The next time we use or see the word worship used is by the devil in Matthew chapter 4. The devil says in Matthew chapter 4 in his temptations of Jesus, he's showing him all the kingdoms of the earth, verse 8, and all of their glory. And he says to him in verse 9 of chapter 4, all of these I will give you if you fall down and worship me. Fall down and worship me. You know, what is Satan asking for there? What does he want Jesus to do? Is there some kind of incantation, certain words, certain posture required? Obviously, that there is no specific thing there. He's asking Jesus to give him deference. He's asking Jesus to acknowledge Satan's position, or really, in this case, it would be of giving Satan greater position than he really had. Jesus replies to him, says, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." So here you see the idea of worship and serving, two separate things, obviously connected, but understanding that God is the only one worthy of worship. God is the only one worthy of that position. God is the only one worthy of that kind of honor in our lives, and Jesus certainly understood that. Coming forward to the 8th chapter, in the 8th chapter, and this is one where one of the reasons I wanted to go through Matthew is to show this not problem necessarily, but just an issue, I guess, with the ESV, English Standard Version that I use. When you get to verse 1 and 2, verse 2 of chapter 8, it says, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, if you will, make me clean." King James Version says worship. Instead of knelt, it says the leper came to him and worshiped before him. He may have knelt. He may have. I'm not saying he didn't. But the word is he worshiped. He worshiped. And what I want to point out to you is that could look like a lot of different things. Maybe he did that in silence, or maybe he did it with, an hour-long dissertation on how much he loved Jesus. I don't know what that looked like, but he came before Jesus and he worshiped before him. That's powerful to think about. That's powerful to think about. He knew who Jesus was, and he came to him to worship. And part of that is, Lord, if you will, make me clean. Maybe that was all of it. Maybe if you read that, he came to him and worshiped before him, saying, "Lord, if you will, make me clean." He came to Jesus and worshiped him, saying, "Lord, if you will, make me clean." This request was a form of worship. He's acknowledging Christ. He's acknowledging who he is. He's acknowledging his power, and he's making a request of him because he believes in who he is, and he believes that power. Brethren, every time we address God, whether it's verbally where others can hear or in our own hearts, in our own minds. Every time we address God, every time we make a request before God, we're worshiping Him. We're acknowledging who He is. We're acknowledging that He's higher than we are. We are acknowledging that He has power over our situation and over the world that we live in. I think it is a beautiful thing. And Jesus obviously cleansed his leprosy and asked him to say nothing, as he did from time to time. Similarly, in chapter 9, verse 18, here a ruler came to Jesus, a story that we reference fairly often, as he asked Jesus to come before him or come to his daughter. But look what he says in verse 18, very similar language. A ruler came and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." And again, that's the word, that's the same word. It doesn't necessarily mean that she knelt, or I'm sorry, he knelt. It means he worshiped. Maybe he knelt and maybe he prostrated himself before, and maybe he lifted his hands up, or we don't know, but he came and he worshiped. He worshiped, and the text says he worshiped saying, "My daughter has just died." What it feels to me as I read that is him saying that his daughter had died, "Come and lay your hand on her and she will live," was a form of worship. That was his worship. He was in a horrible situation. And all he did was go to the one to whom he had faith could address that problem and ask for help. And that was worship. Isn't that beautiful? It's so beautiful. Chapter 14, we see it next, chapter 14 of Matthew, verse 33. This is the occasion where Peter walks on the water. Verse 29, Jesus first was walking on the water. There's a beautiful story there. When finally Jesus comes into the boat, we understand from verse 32, the wind ceased, the storm was done, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God. Truly you are the Son of God." They recognized something. Some of them in different ways had recognized before, but they make a note of this. They say, "Truly you are the Son of God." That is worshiping the Lord. That is worshiping God by acknowledging that, by saying that, by knowing that in your heart. The next chapter in verse 15, chapter 15, verse 9, Jesus tells us about people who can worship him in vain. Chapter 15, verse 9, "In vain do they worship me." How could you worship in vain? People will tell you all that matters is your heart. All that matters is what you're feeling in your heart. If you're trying to honor God, if you're trying to glorify God, then you will be honoring God. You will be glorifying him. You will be worshiping him by virtue of the fact that that's what you desire. This verse tells us that it is possible to worship God in vain. How is that possible? Teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. When we do our will instead of God's, we are not worshiping him. We're not worshiping him. When we do our own will instead of his, when we teach our own will instead of his, we're no longer worshiping him. And this, I think, helps us to understand what it means to worship. Because if I do his will, I may not even say, "Well, I'm going to worship God by doing this commandment." Every time I do his commandments, I am worshiping him. And every time I teach his commandments, I am worshiping him. But if I teach something other than his commandments, then that's vain. No matter what I say about it, that's vain. That's vain worship. God is not honored by that. God is not lifted up. I am lifting myself up. Same chapter, verse 25. Same chapter, verse 25. Another one of these where the ESV translates it knelt. A Canaanite woman. This is right after, obviously, he's talking about these people worshiping in vain. Worshiping in vain And we're told about this woman who is oppressed by a demon. And she says in verse 22, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." He did not answer her a word. And the disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, or she came and worshiped before him, saying, "Lord, help me." Several of these stories, and again, it's planting this in my mind. And that's something we need to consider: is this ideal of worship being something that can be done, that we do by simply acknowledging who our helper is, by simply acknowledging who God is and what He's capable of doing for us. Look what Jesus says to in response to that worship. In verse 28, He says, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done to you as you desire." Be it done to you as you desire. Because of her faith, which was shown, her faith was shown in her worship. Her faith was shown in how she worshiped God. I think that's a great thing to put beside Jacob worshiping on his staff. All he was doing was acknowledging who God was. Chapter 18, there's an interesting thing I'd like to point out here in chapter 18. This is a parable. In my Bible, it's titled "The Parable of the Unforgiving Servant," that begins in verse 21. This is the parable that we reference where the servant owed so much. He owed so much. And when the master calls him in verse 25 and orders him to be sold and his children and all that he has sold until payment can be made, the servant fell on his knees. And again, that's the same word. The servant worshiped, imploring him, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything." Here, in different, slightly different from the other examples we've seen, the worship is not so much a request for something to change as it is for a request for forgiveness. The request for forgiveness. God has the power to forgive. This man in this parable is acknowledging this man's power over his situation, and he worships him. And that may have included the kneeling, but certainly it included the worship that we've been describing. Later on in verse 29, his fellow servant falls down and pleads with him. That's not the word worship. This is just a begging. He's imploring him, pleading with him. But the servant in verse 26 to the master is worshiping him. And I should be careful how I say verse 26. Just one, there's actually three things here in verse 26. I meant to point this out, so let me be clear. The Greek word does imply that he falls. He does fall. Then it implies a worship, and then it implies an asking or a saying of something. So there's really three things here: falling. He has fallen, but then he is worshiping and he's asking him something. So very different from what you see in verse 29. Let's go to chapter 20. We're almost through. I appreciate your patience. I feel like this was profitable for me. I hope it will be for you. Matthew chapter 20 and coming down to verse 20. This is an interesting one. This is the sons of Zebedee, two disciples of Jesus. Their mom comes, their mommy comes and makes a request of something, makes a request of Jesus. And the word there is the word worship that we're considering. She worshiped before him. And again, this is ESV says knelt before him, kneeling before him. But a more accurate translation, I believe, would have been worship. She worshiped before him and asked for something. So the worship and the asking there is separated. She worshiped and asked. Again, it's interesting to think what that looked like. It's interesting to think the different forms that could take. But here she has something on her mind, and there's a lot of lessons in all of that. But but you see that same pattern. The next times we see it, two more times in the book of Matthew, is chapter 28. Chapter 28, this is after the resurrection of Jesus. This is after he has been resurrected. And Jesus is appearing to them. And in Matthew 28, verse 9, it says, Jesus met them and he says, "Greetings." And they took hold of his feet and worshiped him. Now, again, they took hold of his feet. That's literal. They took hold of his feet and they worshiped him. So the taking hold of his feet is not the only thing. There's two separate things. They took hold of his feet and then worshiped him. And again, what does that entail? Does that include a dissertation? Does that include any kind of necessary words or anything? Does the grabbing of the feet necessitate the worship that follows? Certainly not. What you're seeing here is the narrative of the story is they take hold of his feet and then worship him. And that's the part that I just think is beautiful to consider. You see it again in verse 19. I think I wrote that down wrong. Verse 17, thank you. When they saw him, they worshiped him. Now here, there's no grabbing of the feet. There's no specific, this is just very general. What did that look like? What did that entail? We don't know, but they worshiped him. Some did not. It says some doubted, but some worshiped him. They worshiped him. So I'd like you to take that home, and I'd like you to meditate on that. I want to plug in two thoughts real quickly before we're dismissed. Remember from John chapter 4. In John chapter 4, we're told, as Jesus is having this discussion with the woman at the well, she has a question about where to worship. And Jesus tells her it doesn't matter, or a time is coming when it won't matter. A time is coming when it won't matter where we worship. But what will matter, he says, is that we worship God in spirit and in truth. Spirit and truth. And he says, in that context of needing to worship God in spirit and in truth, he says, God is seeking such people to worship him. He is seeking such people to worship him. Again, I would like you to consider, this is not a matter of God needing our worship. This is a matter of him wanting us to do what's best for us. It's best for us to acknowledge who he is. It's best for us to remember our place and to remember how much greater he is than us, and make sure every moment of our lives is lived in that worship mentality, that worship mindset, so that everything that I'm doing can be described as a worship to God. Everything I'm doing can be worship to him. The one other passage I would ask you to think about, and this is another study for another day, but if you go through the book of Revelation, you will also see the word worship used a lot. And in that book, in the book of Revelation, you see two things being worshiped, two people being worshiped. And if you've studied Revelation, you know it's either the beast or God. You're either worshiping the beast or God. And when you plug that into what we've been discussing, every moment of your life, every decision that you make, everything that you do, if you're walking in the will of God, if you're doing his things, his ways, then you are worshiping him. If you're not doing that, if you're not walking in his ways, then you're worshiping the beast. You're worshiping the beast. We are going to be worshiping one or the other. And so much of Bible study comes down to that. So much of Bible study comes down to the two paths in front of you. Are you going to listen to your Creator and live his way? If you do that, you'll be worshiping him. You'll be worshiping him every moment. But if you turn and you go the other way and you listen to yourself, you listen to the world, you listen to anything other than God, you're worshiping the beast. It's not a matter of deciding not to worship either. You're either worshiping God or you're worshiping the beast. I'd like you to consider that. Think about that. Let's make sure we're living our lives in worship to God every moment by following his will. As we sing the song of invitation, if you know for whatever reason that you need to come forward, make changes in your life, perhaps make confession of sin, ask for the prayers of the church, whatever the case may be, please take advantage of this opportunity as we stand and sing.